Asiari from Indonesia. He wants to talk about abstract objects. Science number 0. Hi, Asiari.
Yes, brother.
Hello.
What is going on?
Hi, how are you? I guess you
I'm doing
wanted
great. Yes,
to you about why God may exist but can't be known.
exactly.
Okay, so what do you think? Give us your take on it.
Okay, so I am an agnostic theist. You know that God is
Mhm.
ultimately unknowable, but faith is the most reasonable response to an inherently unreasonable problem. I think here is for the why. Science realism is a gross overlook on the fact that science as a methodology works because of hidden philosophical assumptions, because of axioms that are accepted as true, accepted as true regardless, without evidence. You know, Lawrence Krauss, he is bringing this Trojan horse. That Trojan horse being the saying that science does not need philosophy. He brings the Trojan horse into the world of new atheists. But he knows that inside of that Trojan horse, there lies the hidden philosophical assumptions that has made science work. Let me tell you about the history that gave rise to science, and that is the philosophy of Plato. The principle of causality exists within this world as a universal, an ideal form, something abstract and immaterial.
Mhm.
Platonism suggests that changes happening in the physical world is governed by a universal principle of causation. And this universal principle of causation is an abstract object and thus immaterial outside of this world. An infant will grow to a kid, then a teen, with no other factors withstanding. Science may be a descriptor of physical reality, but ultimately it cannot explain why causation in this world exists at all. And in the same time,
Is
science
it,
acknowledges this causation
let's take a
and
break,
acknowledges.
Asiari, and so we can because you threw a lot out there right now, and I know Jordan had something you wanted to say. So Jordan,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I want to make sure I'm following what you're saying. So it sounds like what you're saying is that causation exists. Things are an event is caused by another event, which is caused by another event backwards in time, and this is an abstract object and therefore immaterial. And it sounds like the connection you're drawing is between this immaterial object and God, which would be immaterial in most conceptions. Is that accurate? Does that sum up what you were saying?
Indeed, brother, you've captured it perfectly. It is
Awesome.
my thinking.
So hold on. Just before we move on, because that's the foundation of your argument, then it's important to really hash it out. And it seems to me that that causality is not an immaterial object in the same way that God is said to be an immaterial object. Causality is an observation. We observe that time flows in one direction. We observe that things proceed from causes generally. But even that at a base level is not certain, depending on interpretations of quantum mechanics, for example. If you buy into certain interpretations, causality, like at a fundamental level, the universe may not be deterministic. It may be indeterminate. Things can happen without a cause at all. And so it doesn't seem like we have to have this universal principle of causality in order for science to progress. And I don't see the link between this observation that things proceed from causes and therefore God exists.
Well, let me walk you through that. In the absence of causation, you say that it is indeterministic, right? The word. Well, then science will not be distinct from magic. Thus, we cannot rationalize that science is a valid method in discerning reality, right?
But if anybody anywhere can do the same thing with the same instruments, right? Why would that be considered magic?
Well,
right. It being indeterminate doesn't mean that
because
it's random.
That's science is dependent on the ability to do that, right? If you come up with a new idea, a new experiment, and you test it, other scientists everywhere around the world should be able to test that same thing and get the same results. And that's not what magic does.
Works, right? Science works. So why does
Yeah.
science work? Because causation exists as a method. No, not as a method, but an abstract principle. Without it, science cannot exist. One guy in East Asia will not get the same result as that guy in Western Europe, and science itself cannot be established as anything distinct from magic.
So why does this lead to a god?
Yeah,
what about
that was my next question. That was exactly my next question. How does this lead us to a god?
Well, with science working, wouldn't science specify of the existence, at least, of abstract objects like causality here, right?
I mean, if by abstract objects you mean a concept that I can't give you a cup of causality, then yeah, I mean, I guess they exist in some sense. But again, I'm not sure that's the same sense. I think saying causality exists and God exists, that's equivocating on the term exists, because causality is just a label we assign to this thing we're observing, that this trend of things progressing from one moment to another because of another moment, right? That's just a label we've attached to something.
It's an action, it's a verb, not a noun.
Right. As opposed to a god, which would be a being of some description somewhere or nowhere, depending on how you want to, quantify your god, I guess. So like, again, I'm not seeing the link between having words for observations and a deity in the classical theist sense.
Right.
Okay.
Right. You're comparing an action to an actual thing.
Okay, well, here is the thing. Here is the philosophical alternative to that. What you're saying, that causality is a verb, not a noun. It is something that is rooted in a nominalist doctrine made popular by David Hume. He proposed that idea that causality exists and that it is only within the mind of the human reason, that it does not exist in real life. So, but can you say that science works, brother? Can you say that science works?
I mean, sure, science is a productive tool. It's a tool that humans have developed that has shown itself to be useful. And I think it's fair to say that the scientific method rests on certain assumptions. So, I mean, that's true. Science doesn't spring out from nowhere. But again, I don't see why science working, or the fact that things usually, at least on a macro scale, that things progress from causes. I'm just not seeing the link between that and a deity.
Well, there is a 1940s book by a Christian, Ideas Have Consequences. And the idea that says that causality is a verb, not a noun, like I said, is popular by David Hume. It is in the philosophy realm called nominalism, which is the rejection of abstract objects actually existing, actually existing, as like the universals in Plato. It doesn't exist. But let me tell you, this is the reason why the cultural shift happens. This is why the reason we're seeing the.
But how are we? But we're still wanting to figure out how you're getting to a god from this.
For the sake of argument, abstract objects exist. Let's just, and cause is an abstract object, and abstract objects exist. Okay, cool. Where does God come in?
Well, then we can say that the acceptance of scientific realism among most atheists is attributed to a lack of exposure and therefore consideration to physical alternatives. Like what I told you earlier, there is an alternative to nominalism, but the atheists most likely just accept nominalism as the only true way without ever considering the alternative to nominalism, such as moderate realism, or that conceptualism, or Platonism, or absolute creation.
I mean, I used to be a Christian, so I used to think all those things were real. I'm just waiting for, I just require evidence. I need some evidence to, basically, here's the situation. I see, we both agree that a natural world exists. Whether or not you think there's a supernatural layer on top of it, that's the conversation we're having, but you and I both agree we exist in some kind of shared reality. You would like me to believe that beyond this shared reality, there is some other layer, a supernatural layer of some description with a deity of some description. So in order for me to move from the reality we both agree on to accepting this additional layer, I need some kind of evidence, by which I mean an observation or something for which God is a requirement to explain. Do you see what I'm getting at here? I need a reason to believe in your God is what I'm trying to get at.
Okay. A reason to believe in God. Well, I give you the ontological argument for God, brother. I give you ontological argument for God. Are you familiar with Anselm of Canterbury?
Yep.
Or Rini
Very
de-
familiar with that argument.
Yep. Heard it a million times, and it doesn't work. It's not.
all
It's
right.
not. It is not. This is not direct evidence for God. It doesn't get us there.
There is no direct evidence. That is the proof. I'm saying that is what I'm saying.
That's what I'm saying. You can, and that's what Jordan has just said. You're not going to convince us unless you can give us some kind of evidence. If there is a being and this godlike being and this godlike being exists, there should be some kind of evidence that this being exists.
I'll say this: if this being exists, we can at least, even if we can't say for sure whether or not this God exists, we can look at the universe we live in, and we can use that to at least narrow down the range of possible gods that could exist and are consistent with the universe we're in. So the fact that Kelley and myself both are open, I don't want to speak for Kelley. I know that I am open to the idea that a God exists, and I'd be happy to believe that one exists given evidence. I'm willing to believe it. I'm not resisting. And so all a God would have to do to convince me that he exists is like, give me evidence. And if God is powerful and all knowing, he knows what would convince me. And the fact that I am in this position and yet do not receive this evidence says at least that God either doesn't know what would convince me, so he's not all knowing, can't give me that knowledge, so he's not all powerful, or wants nothing to do with me, in which case he's probably not all loving. So if a God exists, he definitely can't have these attributes because of the universe we exist in. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense, bro. But again, just because it makes sense, let me indicate one blind spot there. It seems that you are entirely captured by the realist doctrine of philosophy. You know, reality is substantial, it is sensual. And so
What's the problem with that?
Evidence. Everything has to have evidence. But have you considered
yes, I want to have evidence of everything I believe. That way I can ensure that I believe more true things. I am not going to believe something until I know it to be true. And I can't know it to be true without evidence. So that's why I don't accept the God existing at this point.
Do you
because
believe
I have seen no evidence of a God.
through experience? Do you
Pardon?
believe that all knowledge is obtained through experience?
Sure.
Sure. What about a priori? What about Platonism saying that knowledge can be obtained by logical consistency?
What does this have to do with evidence for God? It just seems like you're throwing a bunch of, philosophical things at us, but you're not getting us any bridge to God.
I mean, I'm happy to accept logical arguments as evidence if they're sound. I'm happy to all these things, but they need to like actually get to a God, right? And so I think it sounded like the point you were trying to make is that at a foundation, we're making some kind of assumptions about reality that we can't demonstrate are true. Like I can't prove hard solipsism, the idea that the reality I experience is real. I can't prove that that's true. Like I could be a brain in a vat or whatever. To that, like, sure, but I also don't know why I should care about that possibility. Like, I am happy to just accept that the world I live in is real. Like, I think that's just something I'm going to believe, and that's fine. Like, I'm happy with that.
So why then you said you were looking for evidence?
So I think I have sufficient evidence to make that belief of mine reasonable. The fact that I experience the world, that I exist at all. I mean, I think I can know that directly, right? And that I'm making decisions and predictions based on this assumption that reality exists, and they continue to come true. Now, it could be this is all some elaborate hoax. Maybe I'm in the Matrix or whatever. Those things could be true, but absent some reason to think they are in fact true. There's no, I have no compelling reason to dismiss all of the other evidence I have. So I can't say with absolute certainty that the reality I experience, that you're real and Kelley's real and whatever. I can't say with absolute certainty that that's real, but I mean, I could be pretty sure, right? Like, I don't see why that, and more fundamentally, like Kelley said, I don't see why hard solipsism being an unsolvable problem would get me to God existing.
Yeah.
Well, it should be, brother. It should be. If you were an observer, like who can only see the atoms, and then you look at human beings, what do you see? You may be seeing atoms interacting with one another. You may be seeing neuron activation in that region of the brain or that region of the brain. But can you ever know and deduce from that, oh, you know what? This human exists. This human is conscious. You know, there is mental states. If the area that is lit up is right there.
Well, how is again, Asiari, how is this getting us to a God? I hear the philosophical debate you're having. That's not what we do here. What we do here is we want to know why you believe things, right? We don't need to hear all the philosophy. I think most of us have already heard all this stuff before. So what is it that you said that you think that science can't happen without a God? So let's talk about that. Why can't science happen without a God?
Well, buddy, look, if rationality, if science, they exist because the universe exists. And let's assume that God is true. Therefore, science cannot work without.
No, we're not going to assume God is true. You have to we have just said it. We've told you numerous times. You have to give us evidence before we accept that God is true. We're not just going to assume it.
Like
you can't.
Okay. You want evidence, right? Well, let me tell you, the only evidence is not empirical. The only evidence is, again, philosophical. For
anything that exists in the world, we can get empirical evidence for. Any physical thing that exists within the universe, we can gather empirical evidence for. Anything that's physical. If God is a being, a thing that exists within the universe, we should be able to find empirical evidence for that thing if it exists within the universe.
I'd say that God, so you could say you won't be able to get empirical evidence for God because he's immaterial, he exists outside the universe. Like, that's a position you could hold, right? But then again, like I said before, if that's the way you want to go, that has implications, and that narrows the kind of God that you can reasonably believe in. So if God doesn't intervene in the world, if he doesn't like act in the world, he doesn't perform miracles, he doesn't do any of this, he's just kind of watching things from afar, well, you're not going to have empirical evidence for that God. But also, there's no, that if you can't have empirical evidence in that way, that like if God isn't interacting with the universe, then there's no real reason to think that God exists, right? So deism is as unfalsifiable as it is useless, so basically, the amount of, if you want your God to be an active participant in life and therefore like relevant to our lives, then he's going to have to be subjected to some extent to empirical observation, like his effects at least, if nothing else, right?
Yes, well, look, brother, like I said, the problem of other minds, how do you even know that Kelley is actually conscious? How do you know?
So
there is no,
I would say,
from direct experience.
I think I know. I don't know that I know. If you want to get into like tricky epistemology, I believe that Kelley is conscious because he appears to be a human. So far as from all appearances, he's a human like I am. I am conscious. I have a brain that seems brain states to be tied to conscious states. Kelley presumably has a brain too. And so like the most parsimonious explanation for the observations I have, the simplest explanation with the fewest ad hoc assumptions that satisfies all of the evidence without stretching, is that Kelley is a conscious being just like me. Does that mean he is? I mean, maybe he's not. But again, if you want me to accept a more outlandish idea, I'm going to need additional evidence to justify that. You're basically, you're asking me to buy this ontological commitment, this extra commitment of other hypotheses that I have to lump on, right? So I've got the observation, Kelley looks like me, he acts like me in terms of like we're both humans, etc., right? And that's explained by both having consciousness. If you want me to add the hypothesis, oh, but Kelley is actually different from you in X, Y, and Z ways, well, you're going to have to buy the hypothesis with evidence. And so saying that I don't know that Kelley is conscious is getting you further from demonstrating anything and not closer. You're like moving backwards.
Well, brother, I'll tell you the truth. God is ultimately unverifiable, just like how Kelley is.
Well, then I get until he
Okay.
can verify himself. I honestly, I can't believe that he exists, especially if he's supposed to be such an intricate part of the world and such an influence over my life. I should be able to see at least some evidence somewhere that he exists. And I in 63 years, I haven't seen it. So
I will say this, though. If this God exists and if he is benevolent, then he knows all of this. He knows it would be unreasonable for me to believe in his existence. And so I'm not too worried about it because we're going to get there. I'm going to die. I'm going to show up in heaven. And he's be like, you know what? You were totally right. You shouldn't have believed any of that nonsense. Good job. Like that's how I imagine it going.
Asiari, we have to move on. We've got a lot of other calls. I want to give you the last word. So go ahead. I'll give you a minute to have the last word.
Well, last word, Said is not wrong, brother. It is the only reasonable response to a problem that cannot be known by a reason. And the theists know this all along.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for the call.
Yeah, thank you very much for calling. And you know what? Feel free to call back again. Talk to the other hosts and stuff. You should really call in and talk to J Mike on Sundays because he would love this conversation. He really, really would.